So over the last 5 years, we've seen a dramatic transformation in climate politics that basically no one saw coming. Countries all across the rich OECD have started to spend billions, if not hundreds of billions, for decarbonization. Public funds that go into a clean energy grid, renewable energy, money that goes into industry decarbonization by promoting technologies like hydrogen or CCUS, the rollout of EV subsidies and EV charging infrastructures, as well as the decarbonization of housing through things like heat pumps. Policies there range from the US Inflation Reduction Act and what's left of it, Australia's Repower Plan, Canada's Clean Economy Strategy, Germany's Climate Fund, the Dutch Climate Fund, the EU Next Gen Stimulus. There's not a single country, in my case, selection of 20 rich OECD economies, that has not dramatically expanded its public financial support for decarbonization since around 2018, 2019. Why? Why, after 40 years of doing climate politics and 20 years of green groups, some labor groups, and heterodox economists calling for such a fiscally expansive approach to climate politics, to decarbonization, why have governments slowly started now, over the last years, to introduce such an approach? That's the first research question I'm going to ask and answer today. And the second one is kind of my way into it, which looks at the cross-country variation in the level of spending on decarbonization between different countries. So what explains the timing and the variation of these fiscally expansive climate policies? This does not work. It works on the computer, but it doesn't translate.
Sorry, carry on speaking now.
Perfect. This is just some illustrative data for what I was just saying. You can see here the annualized fiscal allocation, so not realized spending, but policies passed, right? Annualized over the time frame to decarbonization across the two largest OECD economies, Germany and the United States. We see here, this is some countries where we have some data. The US data is based on Rhodium Group analysis as well as CBO data. In Germany, it's just directly from their budgetary documents. You can see that in 2016, there was very minimal expenditures on decarbonization. Just as George just said, in Germany, it was a time of neoliberalism. There was very little idea of green industrial policy. But in 2024, we have to jump here a little bit because there's not enough data. We see a dramatic expansion of fiscal support for decarbonization, with Germany allocating now between 1.4 and 1.5 of GDP to decarbonization, while the United States, under Biden, this is 2024 data, had a commitment through policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, and other DOE commitments of around 120 billion. And that's a very generous top-end estimate, right? And you can see here the unison move into such a fiscal policy direction, but also the strong variation here. So that is kind of my question. And the argument I'm going to make is that this timing and variation can be explained by a shift in the role of industry played in climate politics. What I'm arguing is that a subgroup of industries that used to obstruct climate policies and decarbonization and generally flipped perspective joined new green industrial coalitions united by a demand for fiscally expansive climate policies. And it is this what explains the temporal shift, so this coalition realignment, but it's also the variation in the size and importance of these industries in different countries that can explain the variation between different countries. That's a very abstract version of my argument, and I now will go to take 2 steps back to explain this argument to you within the political economy scholarship. Because, and I hate to be the messenger of this, in political science, we think economists got climate policy all wrong. The theories, why climate policy doesn't work, we think you misunderstood this. And that's why I'm taking 2 steps back, and not 1. According to a now infamous paper, economists are prisoners of the wrong dilemma, which is, of course, an allusion to the prisoner's dilemma problem, the collective action problem, which is supposed to keep governments back committing to climate action. The argument here is that governments are afraid of free riding. They're not committing to climate action because then they're carrying all the cost, and other countries are free riding. That's why they're not acting. This is, we argue in political science and political economy, not the empirically correct way what happened. What actually happened was that climate politics is a distributive problem that creates domestic losers and domestic winners. And the domestic losers were more powerful, were more organized, and blocked time and again pushes for domestic climate policy progress. These big loser coalitions are usually conceptualized as fossil coalitions, brown coalitions, or carbon coalitions. My favorite paper here is Corey et al. And AJPS, which looked at supply linkages between different companies to identify who is actually tied to fossil fuels in the supply chain. But you could fill the entire screen with papers of political scientists that characterize jobs and unions and industries as either green or brown. And the brown ones range from chemicals to cars to coal. They're usually carbon intensive, and that identifies that they are the obstructors of decarbonization. And the green coalition of environmentalists and clean tech startups are just not powerful enough. They don't have the ties to unions, parties, business groups in order to really affect change. So the losers of decarbonization are just too strong. This, in my opinion, is the historically accurate explanation of why we didn't see climate action in countries like Germany and the United States. Because the coal sector, the car sector, didn't want to do it, didn't want to give up their edge in fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based technologies. But of course, while this is a historically accurate explanation, it cannot account for this variation that I talked about earlier in this talk, this rise in climate policies that are fiscally expansive. That's why I'm updating this basic logic of the distributive politics of climate change by arguing that, indeed, it is not complex enough. There are more actors in climate politics than just the brown ones and the green ones. And I specifically argue that the brown coalition is composed of two separate groups of industries. On the one hand, fossil fuel industries that are and remain existentially threatened by the prospect of decarbonization. They will have to end their entire business model and will just, at any corner, try to obstruct it. There's no way out. On the other hand, there's a second group of carbon-intensive industries, and these I call the decarbonizable industries, because they are brown in the present, or historically, but they have a feasible technological pathway to develop a new business model based around low-carbon technologies. These are three types of industries. On the one hand, transport equipment, car makers that can switch to battery electric cars. Second, power makers or utilities that can switch to renewable electricity. And companies that use fossil fuel in production, such as steel makers that can switch to technologies like hydrogen or ammonium. And I argue for them, decarbonization is not an existential prospect that they have to fight tooth and nail. It's just enormously costly and risky for them, which makes them all open for a bargain. We can basically buy them in. We can basically say, we are going to carry, as a government, as a society, we're going to subsidize your transition. We're going to secure your demand. We're going to create markets for you, and then you can securely decarbonize. So we can basically buy them off. This didn't happen for a long time because there was no viable business case behind such subsidies. You can throw subsidies as a company if there is no long run, at least medium run, a business model to them that can be sustainable, they will not go for it. And this, I argue, changed in the late 2010s. In the 2010s, we saw three related developments. We saw immense technological progress that accumulated over time, which for the first time made it feasible for these industries to think about a post-carbon business model. Advances in solar and wind, electricity, overtaking natural gas as the cheapest source of electricity, batteries and electric cars making progress, and hydrogen, at least as a long-term prospect, becoming cost competitive if renewable electricity continues to decline in costs. This was amplified then by Chinese strategic investments, because China, as a gamble, invested in these clean energy industries.
Yeah, related to the China point, how much weight do you give to China's willingness to join the Paris Climate Agreement?
So China is basically an exogenous shock here, exogenous factor. That's why it's in bold, and that China actually took the step to join the Paris Agreement, but more importantly, to put money and subsidies into the clean energy sector is a really important forcing mechanism. So it's very important. It's the most important driver of the three that I have here. But I put more emphasis on their green industrial strategy than on their joining the Paris Agreement. Because they created a competitive threat for these Western decarbonizable incumbents. If we're actually going to decarbonize, they already had a lead, which created not just a threat to decarbonization from these industries, it's going to be costly and risky, but also to do nothing. It created a threat. If they do nothing, they will be left behind by Chinese competitors, which kind of created an urge dynamic that they started to ask for support to catch up. And that kind of generates two hypotheses. And the timing, we should see a shift in industry advocacy that should be there in press statements and industry engagements. We should see a switch before 2019 and after 2019, where they stopped advocating against climate policies and for green industrial support. And we should see variation that the larger these industries are in a country, the more support we should see. So a country that has more steel plants, car plants, more energy-intensive manufacturing, we should see more green industrial support there if that's really what's driving the variation here. And another way to think about it is to go beyond thinking about brown industries and green industries, but also about decarbonizable industries, which can use two strategies. Join these fossil coalitions, which is the standard way that our literature has conceptualized this in obstructing climate policy in order to avoid costs and risks of decarbonization. But they can also join decarbonization bargains with green players, trying to maximize transition opportunities. And this is exactly what I argue has happened in countries, creating these new industrial coalitions behind green industrial policies. First of all, now going into the data, I've conducted. Yeah.
By political advocacy, you mean lobbying, right?
Lobbying.
Okay.
Yeah, lobbying and much more, but lobbying is the core one.
So, you're telling this story in which politics seems to follow the interests of the corporate sector, and I mean, my interpretation from the United States is it's actually the opposite. So as soon as climate became an important political discussion, all the banks started saying, "Oh, we're doing stuff," and then the politics changed, and they've stopped. So, why should it go one direction rather than the other?
Right. So, political pressure is one of the important things that happened in the late 2010s too. I don't think it is as important as what happened in China, but it's one of the three things that took place. And that's not just in the United States, that's everywhere. We had the legislation of new net zero laws, for example, in Europe, net zero commitments in China. We had the Biden administration coming in saying we're going to do this, and which, on the one hand, made it more difficult to oppose decarbonization, especially where there was more legal certainty, but also created a demand horizon, that there's actually a market that is growing if these legal commitments are going to come around. So that's important. I completely agree with you. It just didn't show up because I'm trying to stay within 30 minutes, right? So these things, technological progress, China, and political pressure are all things that I agree with. And in case you're right, in the United States, it was more a politics-driven part. In Germany, it was more industry asking for it. So there's some variation in how exactly these three factors factored in. Okay. Oh no, this is not very good. All right. If you squeeze your eyes, maybe you can see what's happening here. So the case studies, I looked at Germany and the United States because that's the opposite end. On the one hand, they're the two largest advanced economies. On the other hand, they also are very different in terms of their growth models. Germany has a very large decarbonizable sector. They have car makers, steel makers, energy-intensive manufacturing. Over 30% of growth output, as I will show you later, and 20% of value added really comes from these decarbonizable industries, while in the United States, it's half of it. The United States is really a finance, service, real estate, tech-driven economy, where these industries have much less leverage and power. For these case studies, I've conducted over 40 interviews with industry groups in the steel, power, car, sectors, as well as with larger peak industry associations, in order to ask them, what is your position on climate politics? How did it change over time? I've counted press statements, how they shifted over time. And here I'm going to give you just a very broad overview of what happened with green industrial policies in these two countries. Green industrial policies actually have a long history. Support with them started in the 2000s. With green groups and labor groups. This is, for example, the new Apollo plan by the Blue-Green Alliance. They brought that out in 2008. This advocacy for we need to do something in terms of green industrial policy goes back to that era, but was largely unsuccessful because there was very little industry interest in this. This shifted in the 2019, where we saw the rise of incumbent in decarbonizable companies joining these green industrial advocacy. One famous example is here Mary Barra with Joe Biden. Mary Barra is, of course, the CEO of GM. GM dropped their lawsuits against California in 2020. They committed to a net zero transition and started to dramatically support the Biden agenda very publicly. First, the American Jobs Plan, then the Build Back Better Plan, and then what ended up as Inflation Reduction Act. We see this across all industries that I look at. When you look at what the steel industry said about the American Jobs Plan, which was declared as socialism by many conservatives, they strongly supported it. Edison Electric Institute, a longtime foe of climate policy, supported it. Across these decarbonizable industries, we see this advocacy shift, joining what was previously seen as a kind of a green pipe dream of green growth. But then the stories in Germany and the United States shift. In Germany, we see that peak industry associations, which are dominated by exporting manufacturers, joined this push very heavily and wrote extremely detailed reports about where we need subsidies, how much subsidies we need, and what needs to be done, citing Chinese competitive threats, new technological possibilities, as well as the political pressures to go to net zero. There was extremely little pushback in Germany from any other industry. It became kind of the hegemonic position, and Germany ultimately committed to over 60 billion of spending, which is one of the highest amounts of green industrial subsidies we see, as well as keeping them constant, even when the political winds around climate change shift. For example, the new government, the conservative government, came into place, promising to be less aggressive on climate policies. But what did they do? They didn't cut subsidies at all for now. And they're actually right now debating to add more subsidies for green steel and cars as we speak. In the United States, the picture of industrial advocacy was entirely different. The peak industry associations, like the Chamber of Commerce, directly attacked plans to expand green industrial policies. According to my interviews, they were internally divided between fossil fuel companies, companies that just want tax cuts, and a few more regional decarbonizable industries, which are kind of a business in the Midwest, and directly undermining kind of the Biden push, telling lawmakers in Congress to not vote for the Inflation Reduction Act, to not vote for the Build Back Better plan. There was also direct pushback by the oil and gas industry, so a much more contested field here. While these industries, the decarbonizable industries, dominated the German economy, they're core to their business model, had unified support. In the United States, it was kind of a niche, fragile coalition of some Midwestern states, some green groups that just ultimately, I argue, limited Biden's potential to legislate a big industrial push, green industrial push, and ultimately enabled the Trump administration to roll back many subsidies, at the applause of Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturing, et cetera, where only some isolated trade groups were supporting the continuation of these subsidies. But then the question is, can we generalize this story? If there's some plausibility to what I'm saying here, can we generalize it? And here I first developed a measure of the size of the decarbonizable sector using OECD structure analysis database, coding 16 industries as decarbonizable. The big three are power, transport equipment, and energy-intensive manufacturing. That accounts for most of this variation that we see here. It's all published if you want to look at the definition, what industries are exactly in there, in my paper with Jonas Nahm. And you can see here's a large variation, with Germany having over 20% of value added in decarbonizable industries, and countries like Luxembourg, Ireland, Switzerland, Australia, the UK, around 10%. So these are really different types of economies where this competitive threat from China, this ask for green industrial support is much, much lower. That would be the expectation. And second, I developed a fiscal climate policy data set where I went through budgetary documents in 2024 to find a measure of how much these different countries spend on decarbonization. That is spending on industry decarbonization, clean electricity, housing decarbonization, mass transportation, as well as EV. And we can see here the variation. I think this is something that it's just one data point for 1 year. It's extremely labor intensive. Just talked to Nathan about maybe using LLMs to do this in the future. But this is kind of where I am right now with my research. And we were expecting a correlation here between these two, which we are also finding. The up, down, and the bottom low, we have like these finance-led economies, service-based economies, which have much less green industrial support than Germany and Austria, where these decarbonizable industries are really at the core of their growth models. And in the middle, kind of the mixed, like the Nordic economies. All the big countries like Germany, France, UK, and the United States are on the trend line. So some verification that this is happening. This data we can also obviously use to do other things. Here is decarbonization spending and against government ideology. So one hypothesis would be these are just more left-wing and right-wing economies, governments, and we find here, I use party manifesto data here of the head of government to identify economically left-wing and economically right-wing governments, and you can see here that they are that there's very little to this story. I don't actually completely believe this story because we're seeing changes over time according to who's in government, but we would need more data to ultimately find out what's going on here. This is the old story. This is carbon intensity of production. So how much growth do you get out of one piece of carbon? So these are usually the green economies, Switzerland, Sweden, Ireland, and the brown economies are down there, Australia, United States, and Canada. Also very little correlation here. This would be the old political economy story, where greener countries do more and browner countries do less. This is not what we're finding here.
Just in a nutshell, how many sectors are you thinking about when you think about the decarbonization potential here? You said about
sectors?
Yeah. You said how many was it?
So 16.
Okay. And just at a very high level, how do you do that?
How do I count them?
Yeah, or how do you calculate that? How do you define and measure your decarbonization potential?
Decarbonization potential.
Yes.
So it's just basically we can go through a list of industries and think about whether or not they're decarbonizable. We are not actually mentioning their exact potential, so it's like 20%. Like
sure, that's what. But what I mean is like, how are you determining that? How do you measure that?
Whether there's a technology available that can actually help them decarbonize. Or at least on the horizon, right? So things like hydrogen for steel would be in there, right? Or, but you know, so basically the big ones are electric batteries for the transport equipment sector, renewable electricity and grid and nuclear energy for power, and energy-intensive manufacturing. That would be solutions like ammonium and hydrogen, but also electrification. Cement. Yeah. Can also, you know, there are ultimately different processes where you can actually use, you know, cement that does not emit as much carbon, but you can also use carbon capture, for example. The big thing here basically is it's carbon-intensive industries without the fossil fuel industry. That is perhaps the bottom line, because they were usually thrown together, and we are disentangling them.
Sure. In terms of the China story, does it not matter more for like manufacturing and tradable goods than decarbonization industries more generally?
Can you say that again? I didn't.
For China's story, does it not matter more for like manufactured goods that are tradable rather than decarbonization more generally? And also, like, is the availability of alternatives or willingness to use alternatives like trade policy, does that matter relative to decarbonization spending?
Right. So yes, this China story matters for not just for tradable goods, but also for those countries that export more, that are export oriented. And that's kind of the next slide, where it's kind of import adjusted export share of growth. We can see that it's not as strong, but it's strong for the larger countries, where countries that export more for growth are actually spending more. So that definitely plays a role. But there are other sectors that are not directly exposed to the China shock directly in terms of competition, like, for example, the power sector. They are mostly responding to political pressures as well as technological possibility. That lets me go back to this basic argument that there were three things happening at the same time in 2010s. They all converged. It was China, it was technological progress, and it was more climate ambition. And they together led to this switch. But China is the biggest part because it plays into all of the other three, like technology and politics. All right.
Yeah.
We had some there first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to track you down over lunch or something, but in Pennsylvania, the issue of green steel is a big one. And so what you said in passing about hydrogen maybe becoming more commercially viable, you mentioned CCUS. You didn't say that was commercially viable. But so in our work in Western Pennsylvania, we need help with people who really understand those two technologies, what's a boondoggle, what isn't. So I'm just signaling, I mean, you expressed a confidence about hydrogen that is not shared by some of the people I most trust in terms of its ultimate commercial viability. And but anyway, it's a very important issue on the ground. And so I'm saying this out loud because if there's anyone else in the room who's also an expert in these two areas, please come find me. Sorry.
No, I completely agree with this. I'm trying to explain policy variation. right? I'm not saying this will succeed. This is important. I think Germany could lose its business model to China. I don't think it's even very unrealistic. What I'm saying is they are fighting tooth and nail to prevent this by subsidizing, right? So I actually am absolutely not a believer in hydrogen. I think there's very little that can convince me that hydrogen is really cost competitive. But what I can tell you is that countries with larger steel industries spend more money on trying to make hydrogen work. That's what I'm explaining here. This is a policy story, not like a prediction about economic success, where I'm actually quite pessimistic like you are.
You can talk to me anytime.
So, what period of time are you looking at only? Is it from 2000 or is it only in the last decade? Because there is a whole story in the political economy of the energy sector. I mean, fossil fuels, fracking, etc., that changed between, let's say, 2000 to the decade of. There was a big split, for example, in European energy majors like BP and Shell versus ExxonMobil being at the other extreme. And then there was the rise of fracking. And I think I was in the belly of the beast, that there was a big turmoil within it, exactly what positions to take and how much political pressure to apply. Let me put it this way.
So the data I'm presenting here is basically based on interviews and press documents on this decarbonizable sector. Steel, power, cars.
So which period? In the last decade or?
Yeah. So that depends on the data source, right? I look at it basically, I start to look at green industry policy in kind of a very broad case study way, starting in 2000, with this first mobilization. And the first green industry policies that were put in place, and they were not supported by these industries, or not actively supported. And but the interviews, I started to ask people about the shift from 2017, 18 to 2020. I asked them, why did you suddenly come out so strongly for these green industry policies? Why not before? And there, the China story, the technology story, and the politics story really dominate. What happens with the oil and gas sector in Europe with the split? I'm not convinced that there was more than greenwashing going on. I'm ultimately very skeptical of people who say oil and gas can be decarbonized and they have a different business model waiting for them. I don't think there's much evidence for it, even if they sometimes signal. But we can talk about this later. I know there's a little bit of a controversial opinion to take. Andrew?
Yeah, this is relevant, I think, to that last point. For small countries, like, for example, the Nordic countries, is the most salient thing whether they decarbonize their domestic economy from a global green transition perspective or whether they stop being dependent upon oil exports. Norway pays for domestic decarbonization through Statoil. The Gulf states are paying for domestic decarbonization by dumping oil on world markets. How do you take that into account?
So you're asking about other sources of financial.
It just seems to me the relevant thing isn't whether Norway decarbonizes its domestic economy, it's whether it becomes less dependent upon exports of fossil fuels. And these aren't really comparable countries. I mean, Germany taking fossil fuels out of production might make a real impact on global carbon emissions. The way Norway can affect global carbon emissions is by not being dependent upon fossil fuel exports.
So the Norway point is well taken. I mean, Norway is probably the biggest outlier in this case in terms of the relationship to oil and gas. All of the other countries, the fossil fuel sector of value added is between like 1 and maybe 5% in Australia. It is important, but it's not that important. So I'd be happy to take out Norway, and it doesn't change anything. And on the other things, that's a data limitation that I just look at federal budgets. And I don't look at, let's say, they create a public company that then does something. That's just data limitation. So, yeah. And I'm arguing that they are very different, but I'm focusing on this one dimension, the share of these decarbonizable industries. And I'm very encouraging people to look for more variation here in other countries. I hope we can talk more about this later. I don't think I fully explained it, but I want to end my talk now. So this is kind of my abstract model of what happened. We have these global decarbonization pressures, which is net zero laws creating demand perspectives, the technological change, as well as China's lead, leading ultimately to green fiscal policies in order to cope with these new risks and opportunities created. But how much depends on national economic models that create different levels of exposure to these global pressures. But countries like Switzerland and the UK are relatively isolated. They don't compete with China. They don't have big industries that they need to decarbonize. Or countries like Germany and Austria and South Korea are directly impacted and thus react much more strongly. And last thing I wanted to say is kind of talking about the general point of this conference. What can we actually learn from these kind of analysis, right? What is the value of this kind of political economy perspective for this general goal of this conference to expand the knowledge base around industrial policy? If that's our goal, why do we even bother with this kind of stuff? And that is because economists usually think about knowledge base just in terms of economic effects. This is what most of this conference was about. Is this industrial policy, are these export promotion things, are these EV subsidies working for what and how far? But this has kind of the ingrained expectation that what is economically efficient will be implemented by governments. But that is not necessarily the case. What industrial policy is politically sustainable and feasible is different from country to country insofar as the political coalitions that can be mobilized behind them. All right? And this differs by country from country. And the most important variable I point to here is industrial sector composition. That the United States is still doing military industrial policy and AI policy can be explained by just looking at the basic sectorial structure of the United States economy, or at least gives you a hint why they're doing this. While when Germany does green industry policy, while that's much more sustainable there, also can be explained in terms of their sectorial competition and how much they have to lose when they're not competing with China on green stuff. And it also differs by tools. And this is something I didn't really talk about today, but this is kind of where I think the literature should be going. And this is kind of the little graph I have here. And ultimately, to determine good industrial policy, or as Joe has said, rational industrial policy, we need to find the intersection of what is economically efficient and politically sustainable. Thank you so much.